Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillahi ya rabbana zidna ilma wa taqwa wa yaghfir lana dhunubana laqad zalamna anfusana بقصورنا وإثمنا ولا غافل للذنوب إلا أنت فنتوجه إليك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك أما بعد. So we begin what is deemed to be chapter 2 in the book Al-Insaf. And in this section, we are shifting to understand why there's variations among the schools of fiqh, how they developed out of the efforts of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam in terms of knowledge, in terms of their understanding. How did these schools evolve from the framework and the foundation laid down in the first generation? Technically speaking, we're dealing now with the tabi'een and the tabi'een, although there was some mention of the tabi'een in the first chapter. Although there was some mention of the tabi'een in the first chapter. This section, as well as the one that came before, is lined, embedded in it, or embedded in these two sections, are subtle references and at times open references to the idea of the principles of fiqh, what we call the science of usul al-fiqh, or the foundations of fiqh. That science, that discipline, that body of knowledge is concerned in general with a number of issues. There's different ways of talking about it, but we can say that that discipline, firstly, is concerned with what constitutes a source of knowledge that we refer to when it comes to Islam. Secondly, how do we understand those sources? Thirdly, who has the right to make a claim to understand those sources? So, in the first instance, the idea of what is a source in Islam is a question that doesn't necessarily present itself to our thinking with a lot of depth. What are the sources of Islam? The first reply that many will give is Quran and Sunnah. For the scholars of usul al-fiqh, or the principles of fiqh, or the sources and research methodology in fiqh. All those terms overlap with each other. To try to explain what usul al-fiqh means, I'm pointing to a number of different terminologies or a number of different terms to clarify. For the scholar, it's not so easy to just say Quran and the Sunnah. The first thing that comes is what constitutes Quran? And how do you know that it's Quran? And so that gets us into an investigation into what's transmitted as Quran. What's transmitted generation after generation, generation after generation. And in addition to that is the whole concept of how was the Quran memorized and preserved? How was it transmitted? Was it transmitted in a way that opened it to doubt? The scholar of Usul al-Fiqh is not going to let those questions go. The scholar of Usul al-Fiqh focuses on those questions so that what remains after those questions are asked with regard to the transmission and the authenticity of the Quran, the person who asked the question has no doubt that was said to be Quran is Quran and what constitutes Quran. The same line of questioning was made with regard to a hadith and the knowledge of the Sunnah. There's a lot to be said in that, but a lot of details there. But for brevity's sake, and because this piece of information is supposed to serve as a preface to what we're going to cover in the book, and it also is highlighting what we find in these two sections, we won't go very deep into that point about the Sunnah. What we had said is that these two sections indirectly and sometimes directly point to the reality of the principles of fiqh. The foundation of fiqh, the foundation of understanding. Usul al-fiqh became focused as a research methodology system, a minhaj for fiqh, but in reality, the subjects that are covered in usul al-fiqh is what organizes the mind of the scholar. The discipline itself systematizes the thinking of the scholar. And so then that brings us back to the issue of the Sunnah. The same question with regard to what is Sunnah, what constitutes a reliable evidence in terms of hadith. Those types of questions were not only dealt with in usul al-fiqh, and then eventually the sciences of hadith as well, which focus more in a specialized manner on investigating hadith, but the companions themselves were asking these types of questions. The companions themselves were focusing on these types of issues, but maybe not in the same way as we begin to see in the later generations. But the basis, the foundation, the precedent, the practice, to a great extent, can be found in the thinking of the companions, and we'll see some of those examples. And that's why we say that when some make the claim that the madahib don't follow Quran and the Sunnah, they really don't know what they're talking about. It's not a proper claim. The same way to say that uh, what happens in later day scholarship is exactly an imitation of what the companions were doing is not totally in line as well. At times, there's some transformation as to the methodologies that were passed on, and that's where you always have the debate of how do we ensure that we are on the right path, so to speak. And that's the question for scholarship people. The question of integrity of methodology is a question for scholarship. But this concept, we have to put it to rest that we're following Quran and the Sunnah. You're not following Quran and the Sunnah because somebody is taking a hadith and they're following the hadith directly, and the other group is following a hadith that aren't part of the madhab system. It's just ignorance to really have the mindset that this one is following the Sunnah and that one is not following the Sunnah. Both are following the Sunnah. Both are following the Sunnah, and there's discussion to be had on that. And inshallah, it'll come up. So this section is entitled Babu Asbab Ikhtilaf Madahib al-Fuqaha. Right? And so in this section of knowledge, within this text, the Muhaddith Imam Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi rahmatullahi alayhi is dealing with the causal realities or the reasons why the scholars or the schools of fiqh began to have differences. And one of the things that Shah Waliullah initiates this section with is اعلم أن الله تعالى أنشأ بعد عصر التابعين ناشئا من حملة العلم. Right? And so he's beginning with a certain style of speaking. He's speaking from a point of authority that know that what I'm about to say is going to explain the reality of what transpired generationally, that type of concept. So it's translated here as you should know that Allah brought into existence or brought into being a generation of scholars after the companions, after the Tabi'in, who conveyed the knowledge of the deen, or who were the carriers of the knowledge of the deen. The way that he characterizes this is important. Why? Because he's seeing this, Imam Shah Wali, Allah rahmatullahi alayhi, he's seeing this as the fulfillment of prophecy. So he's seeing this process of what took place in the first generations as being inspired by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and being a fulfillment of the prophetic promise or the prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? And in this case, what is the fulfillment of the promise? When the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, alayhi salatu wasalam, a just person from every succeeding generation will carry and transmit this knowledge. Thus, these later persons, this is Shah Wali Allah now, thus these later persons learn the manner of performing the practice of ablution, whether it's wudu or ghusl, the salah, the hajj, marriage, business transactions, and all other commonly occurring things from those who had companionship with the Prophet ﷺ. They transmitted the hadith reports of the Prophet ﷺ. This is in addition to the Quran people. So they transmitted the hadith of the Prophet. That's a source of knowledge. They heard the judgments of those who were in the position of the of judiciary, right? They were judges. That's another source of knowledge. Of the various cities, the fatwas of the muftis, that's another source of knowledge. And they performed ijtihad, meaning they had their own research as well concerning all of these things. And their research had to do with determining the authenticity and the strength of sources, statements, and organizing that body of knowledge so that what needs to get priority is given priority, as well as understanding it and looking to apply it. That's how, and we mentioned this before, the madhahib developed. Not just the four madhabs, the madhahib in general, and any madhab that will develop will have to follow a similar path. There will have to be some organizing of sources, principles of research. It's a process. That's why the idea of just saying I follow Quran and the Sunnah, you follow Quran and Sunnah with what system? That's the question. The idea of saying I follow Quran and Sunnah only, it really, in the scholarly world, sorry about that, in the scholarly world, it really doesn't make total sense. It really doesn't make total sense. In the realm of da'wah, that works. In the realm of da'wah, that works when you're encouraging the people to the deen and to understanding the deen. That simplifies the process. But in the realm of scholarship, it doesn't work, because then the question becomes, how are you working with a hadith that seem to contradict each other? How do you relate the Quran to the Sunnah? How do you know when the language is clear and when the language is unclear? How do you take and translate these things into life? How do you know when an action is sound or unsound? Those are the realities that the tabi'un and the tabi'un had to deal with when it came to the knowledge that was transmitted to them from the Sahaba, right? And that's how the knowledge of Islam with regard to the sciences of the Quran, with regard to the Arabic language, with regard to Hadith sciences, uh, with regard to Usul al-Fiqh overall, and Fiqh itself, that's how it developed, right? So they followed in the footsteps of their teachers and did not fail to study the indications and the ramifications of what a text was saying, what the text implied, right? That's a process of understanding the language of the Quran and the Sunnah. They gave judgments and fatwas, and they transmitted knowledge, and they taught. That was the task of the Tabi'in. So, what was the way of these scholars, so to speak? What was the way of these scholars? To uphold the ahadith that were transmitted. And we began to see that the ahadith that were transmitted, they came by way of different chains of transmission. Not all of them had the same typology or of the same category. And so it's from here that you began to see a concern with hadith sciences more and more. Although, if you go back to the first section, and there's other works as well, it shows that the companions themselves were dealing with some sort of hadith methodology. So at times when some of the companions would relate certain things, some of the leading companions would correct them or check them and even demand that they support what they said. So even in the time period of the companions, there was this system of dealing with the hadith. And it varied uh, in detail in terms of how it was that the companions dealt with that knowledge. The reason why I say that is because you see that Aisha had an approach, Umar had an approach, Abu Bakr had an approach. There were systems in place, and all of that together constituted the knowledge of the Sahaba or the knowledge of the Sunnah. The difference is that there was no fabrication of hadith, there was no falsehood with regard to the statements of the Prophet or with regard to the teachings of the Prophet with in relation to what he said or did. The fabrication hadith was not a problem that the companions had to deal with. That was a problem that later day scholars had to deal with. So you begin to see that they also were dealing with how it was that the Tabi'un and the Sahaba understood the text. That's to summarize the point. And they began to look at things like, what do we do when the text of a hadith seem to contradict one another? And so in point 2 here it says, with regard to their methodology, it was also the procedure of the early scholars to refer to the opinions of the companions in cases when the hadith reports of the Prophet ﷺ were at variance with one another about some issues. If the companions held that some hadith were abrogated or that their literal meaning should be disregarded, or if they did not pronounce them abrogated but concurred leaving them aside and not holding them to be obligatory to follow, this would be equivalent to rejecting or not enacting the text because the rationale or the reason for implementing it wasn't in place. So now you have the knowledge of the Quran. Now you have the knowledge of the Sunnah. This knowledge of the Sunnah is the knowledge of the companions, and then you have the knowledge of the Tabi'in. And in this knowledge, what's transmitted is how to deal with the Quran, how to work with the ahadith, how to utilize and benefit from the judgments that were made by the early generations, the first 2 generations, and how to benefit from their fatwas. The judgments that they made were something that was considered to be obligatory to follow. And so more and more you're adding onto what constitutes the knowledge of Islam. How do you work with hadith when they seem to contradict each other? What's the system in place? That becomes a body of knowledge. Determining whether one hadith is no longer practiced or not is abrogated. That's a body of knowledge. Understanding the reasons why certain actions were undertaken. That's a body of knowledge. Because from that knowledge, you're also going to get the practice of analogy or qiyas. Because qiyas or analogy depends heavily upon you understanding the rationale of why something was practiced. And qiyas or analogy is called upon or referred to in cases where the Quran and the Sunnah literally doesn't speak to the issue, but indirectly speaks to the issue. So how is it that the Quran and the Sunnah then, how is it that it's going to apply to these situations which don't have a clear literal text to deal with them? Well, you have to extend the meanings of the Quran and the Sunnah to apply to that situation. The same with the judgments and so on and so forth that were made. The third issue that comes up is when the companions and the followers differed on the matter. How do you deal with that? When the companions and the tabi'in, when they differ among themselves, meaning when the tabi'in differ with the companions, how do you deal with that? So then from here, every scholar was for the school of the people of his city and his teachers, because what happens here at this point in time is that you can have one region is following Quran, is following Hadith, is following judgments, following the Fatawa, and then there's certain local situations that call for that knowledge to be applied in those local situations. So now when there's differences between the Tabi'in and the Sahaba, how do you deal with that reality? Well, that's how you begin to see that the people just went with their local knowledge. And the reason why they went with their local knowledges was because it was easy to verify what was being said. There's details to this stuff, people. But the idea here is to open up the mind of how it is that when we talk about the knowledge of the Sahaba or the minhaj of the Sahaba, what that really means. What does it mean when we say the first three generations? What does it mean when we talk about the madahib? What's that knowledge entail? That knowledge really entails a deep understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah in principle and in practice. How to work with the Quran and the Sunnah and how is it applied, right? And so that experience and those insights is what scholarship is all about. So because at this point in time, the easiest thing to do when there was contradictions that may seem to have appeared between the statements the thinking of the companions and the tabi'in and so on and so forth, the easiest thing to do was to go with your environment, to go with your local scholarship. That's how the madhab developed with more intensity because they began to focus on the knowledge of their locality. So Medina was a locality where there was knowledge. Medina was the center of knowledge. But also because the companions left to Sham, they left to Sham, which is Sham is a historical term that labels the geography of Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon. That was considered Sham, that whole region. Also Iraq, Kufa and Basra. Companions went there and their schools developed there. Uh, People followed their positions. Scholars came after them. So at this point in time, hadith was not codified. Hadith didn't begin to be codified until the time of going into beginning with Malik, but Malik codified the hadith of Medina, but hadith was not codified in the larger sense, meaning gather the ahadith of the different regions because the companions went to different regions. So now, at this point in history, after the companions they left this world and they went into the hereafter, it was necessary to pause and collect all of the information that they taught, collect the knowledge that they taught with regard to the Sunnah. So that really didn't take place until the time of Imam Shafi'i. It started to take place where the scholars of Hadith they started to focus on collecting that knowledge, and you see that highlighted in the conversations between Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmed and their work. But a more accurate statement to say is yes, Hadith began to be codified early on, but it was by region. But when we talk about codification, uh, we really are indicating to the codification stage of the Sunnah, where we're no longer focusing on regions. We're moving beyond regions and we're focusing on wherever it is that the companions have transmitted knowledge. So the Maliki school began to develop based on the opinions of Umar, Ibn Umar, and Aisha, and the knowledge that was in Medina. That's how the Maliki school developed. The Hanafi school developed uh, based on the positions of Ibrahim al-Nakhai and Shah Wali Allah has it that Kitab al-Athar and the Musannif of Abdur Razak and Ibn Abi Shayba, these were some of the major texts along with the teachings of Ibrahim al-Nakhai that that the Hanafi school was focused on. The Maliki school was focused on the Ahadith of the Muwatta, right? And you see in this time period that whether you say is Khalifa Mansur or whether you say that it's or whether you say that is other than him, Imam Malik rahmatullahi alayhi, Harun Rashid, uh, there's two opinions that the Khalifa Mansur performed the Hajj and he told Malik that he can make the Muwatta the book that everybody would follow. Imam Malik rejected that and said that the companions they had spread to different regions, and when they spread to different regions, they uh, took their knowledge with them. So there should be no imposition of one approach on everyone because of this reason, because people began to develop their understanding based on what they were taught by the companions that were in their regions. They also is also said that it was Harun al-Rashid. He consulted Malik about hanging the Muwatta up in the Kaaba and urging the people to act upon it. In any event, uh, Imam Suyuti related these scenarios, but the reality of the situation is that Imam Malik rejected forcing the fiqh of the Muwatta and the fiqh of Malik to be imposed on everyone. With the Hanafi school, things became a little different because the Hanafi school, in some ways, due to Qadi Yusuf, Qadi Abu Yusuf, uh, Abu Yusuf became part of the court system in the Khilafah. And so, in many ways, because of that, the Hanafi madhab began to be imposed uh, by way of the court system in some regions. And in addition to that, with time, you begin to see that the madhab spread also, not just based on knowledge, but with the political leadership. One of the things that's interesting is that Imam Malik didn't see uh, that it was good for the government at that time to impose upon the people the practice of the deen. Right? They should enforce, but that was the role of the scholars, but not impose one way. And you find this tension from time to time between the scholars and the rulers, that the rulers interfere. And some of the rulers were, by the way, were heavyweight scholars. It's not like in today's time or some periods of history, but that tension exists. But one of the things is that Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhi, he didn't like that. Imam Abu Hanifa also had a standard for government. Uh, he believed in the just leader, and you see, especially in the case of Zayd bin Ali, that he supported him in in uh, in the struggle for establishing just government. So even though you find that he was semi-retreated from the political realm, indirectly, he supported just government. So they had their ways. Even Imam Malik, rahmatullahi alayhi, had his way of dealing with the political leadership. But the scholars, no doubt, had a lot of influence. By the time Imam Shafi'i comes, Shah Waliullah says Shafi'i came on the scene during the early emergence of these other two schools, the Maliki school and the Hanafi school. And at a time when their legal theory and their fiqh had become systematized. Prior to that, prior to these schools emerging, the Maliki school and the Hanafi school, because they didn't emerge in a vacuum by themselves, there were other schools that existed. There were other schools that existed, like the school of Imam al-Awza'i, like the school of Imam Ibn Abi Layla. Those schools existed. Other schools existed. The school of Jafar Sadiq. Uh, these schools were important because the reality is that there were many madhahib that existed, but the tendency was that of, at this time period, of being either from Ahl Hadith or Ahl Rai. And really, what we were talking about before about the different regions having inclinations. The thing about it is that sorry, just 1 second. To come back because I lost my train of thought a little bit. The reality of the regions was that they had two tendencies. So you find in the Medinan area and the Mecca, there was a heavy emphasis being put on hadith. And then you find that in the Iraq region, there was a heavy emphasis put on understanding the rationale behind a hadith and utilizing analogy. These characterizations are not always so exact. But this is how the history of fiqh has been spoken about. You have the idea of Ahl al-Hadith and you have the idea of Ahl al-Rai. The reality is that both of these tendencies, we can see them among the Sahaba. But what happened by the time that Imam Shafi'i emerged, these tendencies and the idea of regionalism, when you brought those realities together, it meant a clash between the people of Iraq and the people of the Hijaz. And sometimes you see it in the fiqh and how it develops. And this is why, people start talking about the whole idea of Quran and the Sunnah, because as time unfolds, people have a tendency of disconnecting from principles and methodology and evidence in the sources. And then the whole idea of sectarianism comes in. And that's why uh, some people, when it comes to the whole concept of following Quran and the Sunnah, that's why they push that reality hard, because they're trying to overcome the problem of sectarianism and the problem of narrow understanding. But when Shafi comes, he looked at the methodologies among the Malikis and the Hanafis, and he found some gaps. And at the same time, he came in a time period where there was uh, a movement to collect the hadith. Right. So in Kitab al he discusses a hadith methodology. And one of the things that Imam Shafi does is he starts laying down the condition that a hadith should not have a broken chain of transmission, meaning that we should be able to trace it directly to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Well, this was revolutionary because what came before, firstly, was that there were certain hadith that were sahih, but they were sometimes coming through a broken chain, which for Imam Shafi meant that the hadith was da'if, it was weak. But that was not the case for Imam Malik or Imam Abu Hanifa. They were from a generation of people that were meeting the Sahaba, so there was no issue for them in that regard. There was no concern, but Imam Shafi'i began to lay down a stringent condition. And part of this was because Imam Shafi'i traveled. And because he traveled, he began to have access to hadith collections and approaches to knowledge that the other region didn't have. That doesn't mean that the Shafi'i madhab is it and no other madhab has ranking, but Imam Shafi'i introduced a major development in hadith methodology and also in scholarly research techniques. The other issue that comes up was the principles that were being used to reconcile between the evidences. Sometimes Imam Shafi'i didn't agree with those principles in the way that they were applied. So he began to refine the process a little more because he had more hadith to work with as well. So all the scholars, they contributed to each other, right? There's a lot of details that are here, that doesn't make sense to bring them out because it can be confusing, right? These sessions are meant to kind of point to scholarly methodology, but everyone is not at the same level. You would have to have some hadith background and usul al-fiqh background to really understand the details. But what happens is that Imam Shafi'i begins to criticize the methodologies of Malik and Abu Hanifa, those schools of thought. And at the same time, one of the things that is extremely important to understand is that Imam Shafi'i is no longer accepting the idea of regionalism, of a hadith only being accepted from one region. Imam Shafi'i starts to push for the collection of a hadith regardless of region, for it to be a more systematized process and more accessible and more accessible. And the madhahib, they have to adjust to this reality. And on page 23 in my version, it says, by this period, the hadith scholars had deeply investigated the chains of transmission and traveled to all corners of the earth, seeking them out from the bearers of traditional knowledge. Also, by this time, the body of those hadith that had only been transmitted by one or two persons among the companions, and then passed on from them by only one or two persons, had proliferated, and things had continued in this vein. Thus, these hadith had not been known to the scholars who came before, and they only came to light by the scholars of hadith who brought the chains of transmission together. For example, those who transmitted a hadith from the people of Basra, although residents of other regions were ignorant of them. Right? As Shafi explained, that knowledgeable people in the groups of the scholars and the followers never ceased. They didn't stop seeking out hadith that were relative to the issues, right, that the people were facing. And if they didn't find any, then they would seize on some other means. They would refer, in other words, to research techniques that they had. Then, if they later became aware that there was a hadith, instead of following analogy or some other legitimate technique for extending the means of the Quran and the Sunnah, they were abandoned their ijtihad, just like in the case of the Sahaba, and they followed the hadith. Right? That was something that was done. Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi also began to develop his process because the opinions of the companions were collected. Before, the opinions of the companions were not collected to the same extent. So the disagreements among them were not always clear, right? And so here it says the fourth reason for Shafi's developing his own procedure as opposed to that which was found among Malik's school or Abu Hanifa's school, rahmatullahi alayhima. These imams, right, had their own schools. So Shafi'i, what he began to encounter was this hadith movement where the scholars were collecting the hadith, and also he was finding, where it was that the companions began to disagree with one another, their opinions, because by this time the companions are not alive. And he began to see how sometimes a companion maybe didn't know a hadith, was not aware of hadith. So the accumulation of the hadith knowledge and the bringing together of the statements of the companions, when you start to compare these things, you can systematize more. So technically speaking, all these madahib are representing insights into the sunnah. all of them are supporting the preservation of the Quran and the Sunnah. Just like one companion is not going to be able to embody all of the Sunnah, one madhab is not going to also be able to embody all of the Sunnah, but in terms of practice, it's sufficient. But when it comes to knowledge overall, we are able to get a deeper insight into the knowledge of the Sunnah when we look at the contributions of all of these scholars. Because technically speaking, what Imam Shafi encounters, and unfortunately, Shah Waliullah, he really didn't put it here. I don't know why he didn't, but he didn't list. Maybe it was because the lack of popularity in his region of the Hanbali school, but the development of the Hanbali school as well is going almost line in line with the Shafi school. They're sister schools, actually. They're sister schools. They overlap with each other. Just like from one side, the Shafi school overlaps with the Hanafi school and with the Maliki school. And the Maliki school and the Hanafi school overlap as well. For anyone that knows deeper issues in fiqh, we know that there's overlapping of the schools. So we say that to say that the schools give us deep insights into the Quran and the Sunnah. Overall, when we study their history and we study how they deal with things together, we find how miraculous it is that Allah preserved the deen, and how systematic they were. But Shafi, no doubt, he launched a criticism that was very heavy, you know what I'm saying, in impact on the way hadith was being used, on the way that the statements of the companions were to be dealt with, on the language of the Quran. Imam Shafi'i pushed for the literal meanings of the Quran and the Sunnah. And so this transformed even the other schools. They, especially when he wrote his book Al-Risala and the principles of fiqh, the other schools had to follow. They had to adjust themselves. They had to reorganize. If you allow me 1 minute, less than a minute, I just wanted to get this one book to just show a point that's important. So in this book, this is what I was looking at when I got distracted. I purchased this book April 28th, 2004. And the author had died that day. The author is Dr. Muhammad Baltaji, and he was the president of the Sharia department in Dar al-Ulum University in Cairo. And he was also the dean at one point in time. But this is an amazing study. In this study, talking about methodologies in Islamic legislation in the 2nd century according to the Hijra calendar. دراسة أصولية مقارنة لمصادر أحكام لمصادر أحكام عند الأئمة. So in this study, he's dealing with the principles of usul al-fiqh and how it is that the imams of the past utilize the research sources. So he's dealing with the school of Zayd bin Ali, Abu Hanifa, Layth bin Sa'd, Jafar Sadiq, Al-Awza'i, Malik, Ibn Abi Layla, Al-Thawri, Al-Shafi'i. That's by itself 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 madahib. 9 madahib that existed in the 2nd century of Hijrah. And there were more madahib than that. When I bring that up many times because people don't have an in-depth knowledge, or they have just like kind of a popular understanding, just like in this case here in this book, the Hanbali madhab is not really represented. You know what I'm saying? So there's deficiencies, and there's things that Shah Waliullah, he tries to paint Imam Abu Hanifa as being almost a muqallid, a follower in every detail of people like Ibrahim al-Nakhai and others. Well, Dr. Taha Jabir rahmatullahi alayhi, who was one of my teachers, he criticized Shah Waliullah in that. He said, no, Imam Abu Hanifa was a mujtahid. He had his positions just the way that Shafi'i had his positions. And by the way that Shah Waliullah characterizes Imam Shafi'i in this book, Imam Shah Waliullah inclined toward the Shafi'i school. And he had said, but there was not much that could be done in the subcontinent unless you were working with the Hanafi school. But he characterizes the Shafi'i school almost as if to say that this was the epitome of fiqh and that was it. No, the other schools, they refined themselves as well. The madahib adjust themselves with time. So the 2 older schools out of the 4 schools, the Maliki school and the Hanafi school, you're going to see at times in the earlier opinions some tension on some issues because hadith is being codified. These schools existed before hadith being codified, in the sense of the later stage of codification. We mentioned that the Muwatta was codified, the Musannif of Abi Shayba, the Musannif of Abdur Razak, these books, they collected a hadith and statements of the companions and so on and so forth, and statements of the Tabi'een. So there was codification, but the codification that comes in the later day, and I tried to correct myself and be a little more clear, the codification that came with Shafi'i was that in the time of Shafi'i, there was a movement that was bringing together the different regions and not restricting knowledge to region. Not saying that we're just going to focus on the knowledge that's in Yemen, only focus on the knowledge that's in the US. No, but we're going to be universal. We're going to move with principles. So that brought some issues. There's no doubt with that. It brought some scholarly challenges. The thing that we don't want to do is to consider the madahib in the early phase to be completely off the Quran and the Sunnah. No, that's not the case. What it is that the madahib are an effort, so they correct themselves. They develop themselves and they correct themselves. So the more knowledge comes in, they refine certain positions that they had, right? And so this is an important reality to understand. And so when we say knowledge of Quran and the Sunnah, we have to be careful that we don't leave out the other factors uh, that involve knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah. That we're not just seeing, we're just following the text only. Because the reality of the situation is that when we look at these things that we've been reflecting on, the companions had a system for how to deal with hadith. The tabi'un had a system for how to deal with the hadith. And not only a hadith, also the language of the Quran and the Sunnah. And not only that, but also they had a system, especially when you start talking about the tabi'un and the tabi'un, they had a system for dealing with the accumulation of judgments in fatwa. The judgments are like, for instance, there's a land dispute between two parties, and this party has this much acreage, and the other party has this much acreage, and something takes place with regard to inheritance where there's some confusion over who gets what acreage at the end, but this one's been living there for a while, and also there's a river that flows through both parts of the land, and there happens to be gold or oil on there. Yeah, how do you judge in that? So the conclusion to that type of case, the judgment that becomes codified in a book. Then another case comes. A woman dies. She leaves a fortune. Her mom is there. Her brother is there. And her husband, but her husband is dying. And they don't have any children. So who gets the inheritance? Boom. It goes into the book. Judgment on inheritance. In one case, in one region, they're following the moon. Locally, in another region, they're saying, no, we can follow it. In another, boom, the judgment goes in there. So you have a bunch of judgments that are done in a judiciary manner. Then you have another book that comes. It's the Fatawa. Personal questions that are asked to one of the scholars from the early generation, and he gives his opinion, but it's not forced on the people. It's not forced to follow. So then when you bring this together, now you have judgments and you have fatwa, and then on the other side you have this collection of a hadith. So now this is how the knowledge begins to develop, people. You understand what I'm saying? That's the systematization process. So what happens with the madahib is that they begin to refine themselves. You know what I'm saying? But there's no doubt that there's always benefit in staying close in terms of becoming familiar with Quran and the Sunnah. There's no doubt about that. That was the way of the scholars of the past. They used to recite Quran daily. They used to finish it with regularity. They used to listen to ahadith frequently, right? But that is not enough. You have to have techniques and methodologies. So we don't want to get the impression that the Shafi school ended the game and is the most sound and correct. No, the Shafi school added a dimension of knowledge to research, and they forced the other madhab to correct themselves on some points, and they also forced the Shafi madhab to look at itself. So that's the importance of knowledge, is the issue of systematization and the issue of exchange amongst the ulama, which is something that unfortunately amongst the general Muslim community, we don't understand those processes. And when there's a lot of infighting amongst imams and young people of knowledge and so on and so forth, it doesn't create the environment of knowledge. One of the reasons why I go over this book, and I've been going over it with frequency. The last time, I had studied it, I think it was like 2013, and then I did it afterwards. I did some videos on it. So when I keep coming back to it, periodically, and there's some work that I want to do with the book as well, because it's necessary to keep uh, your mind refreshed. There's things also that you come to understand in a different way. But like our teacher Sheikh Taha Jabir said, one of the diseases or the illnesses that plagues the ummah is unnecessary bickering, unnecessary fighting. That's true. That's extremely true. And so, with this type of knowledge, we should have an understanding of how scholarship works to a certain extent. We still need more of a grounding, but we should also have an understanding how it is that the knowledge of the Quran and the Sunnah developed, from this, and how it is that the scholars they support the work of each other. And this was all done. Imagine this was all done, and we're going to come to a close now. This was all done in the time where there was a Muslim political system in place. So what happens with us is that what we have are dawah efforts. We have dawah efforts that are calling the people to the practice of the deen, calling people to certain bodies of knowledge like aqidah or tazkiyat an-nafs. Sometimes they do well, sometimes they fail. You know what I'm saying? But the dawah efforts are keeping alive the deen from the angle of encouraging the people to practice. But the worst thing that we can do is to confuse a dawah effort with the deen. The dawah effort will never be equivalent to the deen. The dawah effort is an approach to reviving the practice of the deen and reforming ourselves. Dawah efforts are not going to reach the level that we see with these types of imams, because these imams are focusing heavily on knowledge, and they're focusing heavily on training students and so on and so forth. Some dawah efforts may come close. We've seen that in recent times with the Salafi dawah, but still has long to go before it can claim to be a madhab by itself, independent uh, of the other schools. And no one really claimed that except with the tendency of Sheikh al-Albani. Uh, Even Imam Shawkani, rahmatullahi alayhi, who I find a lot of favor with, he had his own ijtihadat, but Imam Shawkani doesn't have many followers. So the knowledge of Shawkani is only going to go so far, is utilized by scholars, is referred to across the madhahib. But as far as it becoming a school that evolves to itself, don't think so in this time period. The closest that we got in recent times has been the revival of the Hanbali madhab, which was pretty much dead. It was restricted to a very limited group. But if we applied ourselves as an ummah, it's possible to revive knowledge at these levels. But with the way that we're going, the knowledge of the deen is looked down upon. Just the other day, I was reading a post about Islamic schools, and one of the brothers was commenting, and he was like, some Islamic schools, they have a rate of that participated in the survey that was being talked about online. They have 37 percent ranking of pooling an Islamic studies teacher, and very few. It was like 20 something percent at getting like social studies teachers or English teachers, and then it was like 44% at getting Quranic studies teacher, basically teachers to help memorize the Quran and recite it. To me, none of those numbers meant anything. Is If you're in Islamic school and you're participating in a survey, and say 20 schools participate in the survey, and you're saying that there's only a 37% success rate at bringing in teachers to teach Islam, Islamic studies, which even the term Islamic studies is problematic, but just not to get into argument points. To teach Islamic studies at 37%, you failed. That you have 40 something percent rate of having Quran teachers. You're in the Islamic school system. You're not even halfway there. You failed. So the person was saying this is the state of knowledge that we can't get people to teach secular thinking. And part of the dilemma is you have Muslims talking that shouldn't be really talking about these issues. Muslims talking that are not in education, that are not in Islamic studies, that are, that are not grounded in that regard. And part of the failure that we have in Islamic schools is that they really don't represent Islam. These are schools that have Islamic studies as a subject run by Muslims. So the environment is an environment where there's Muslims, that's it. But it's not like the school is governed, the curriculum is dominated by Islamic values and teachings. With that said, that's just an example of the state of knowledge amongst the Muslims in the US. The other issue, if you look at Dr. Ihsan Bagby's two masjid studies, you have to combine the two together. You can trace back for about 20 years now how it is the majority of the masajid don't have stable imams. And so you start asking, well, what is the role of the masjid? And if you go deeper, even the masajid that have stable imams, they don't keep them very long. So when you start looking at the situation, the crisis of knowledge of Islam in the Muslim community is very high, very high, very, very high. We think that someone leading the salah is it. That's important. But someone leading the salah is not the epitome of understanding the deen. That's the basics of implementation of the deen, and even in that we struggle. And so we're definitely in a crisis of knowledge. So this type of reality that Shah Waliullah is talking about, we're far from this reality. Not only here, but in the Muslim world. Some places we're doing better than others. But most with the way that poverty and war has struck the Muslim world, is only a miracle from Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that we still have people invested in teaching and studying the deen. And that's a carryover from the times of the past, that the scholars still have a position and weight. And alhamdulillah that they have that. But if you were to leave that to the general community, they would destroy that with their opinions. You understand what I'm saying? They would destroy any real role for the scholars, because there's a series of generations that were built, that were groomed, that were developed under the colonial spirit. And so deep down inside, they're really anti-deen, right? I had an experience where a president of an Islamic school tells me, this talk about religion, and this is a president of an Islamic university, you know what I'm saying, having this attitude, and so when we look at these situations, people, we're in a deep crisis. So we study these things so that we correct our understanding, we refine it, and we become more concerned with reviving the knowledge of Islam. Because reviving the knowledge from the educational side on the theory level is one part, practicing is the other part, right? But we can't get to solid practice if we don't have the knowledge base in place, right? And so it's only with the blessing of Allah and these times that we have these types of outlets like this, and it aids, but it has its deficiencies, no doubt. It has serious deficiencies. But we have to focus on talib ilm. We have to focus on talib ilm. We have to focus on seeking the knowledge of the deen. Everything else is supposed to complement that, not replace it. Other degrees, other areas of knowledge, but other areas of knowledge have replaced the knowledge of the deen. And that's why, in part, we're in the conditions that we're in because we haven't learned how to integrate these different dimensions of knowledge, right? But with that, we end, people. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to bring our hearts together and to help us to appreciate Islamic scholarship, to help us have an understanding of the contributions that the scholars of the past gave. And may Allah allow us to be more easy with each other and open the gates of practice based on knowledge for us. Assalamu alaikum.